It was the summer of 1981 in Florence, Alabama, and the heat clung to everything like a second skin. The cicadas hummed in relentless waves through the magnolia trees, and the air smelled of cut grass and river water. Downtown, the pharmacy still had a soda fountain. The hospital parking lot was gravel mixed with asphalt patches. People left their doors unlocked. Everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. Deborah Lynn Carter was 26 years old that summer, and she was exactly the kind of person small towns remember fondly. Soft-spoken, dependable, always early for her shift. She had chestnut brown hair that she kept tied back in a loose ponytail, and she wore the same white nursing shoes every day, scuffed along the toes from years of long hours on linoleum floors. She worked the evening shift at Elk River Medical Center, a low brick building on the edge of town where the hallways smelled like disinfectant and the vending machines only took quarters. The work was steady, sometimes grueling, but Deborah never complained. She'd grown up in Florence, graduated from the local high school in 1973, and went straight into nursing school in Tuscaloosa before coming back home. Her mother, Evelyn Carter, said Deborah always wanted to help people. That's what she told the newspaper later, when the reporters came around asking questions. She had a gentle heart, Evelyn said. She'd stay late if someone needed her. She'd cover someone else's shift without asking for anything back. Deborah lived in a small rental house on Chisholm Street, a quiet block lined with oak trees and chain-link fences. The house had yellow siding and a screened porch where she'd sit in the evenings, drinking iced tea and listening to the radio. Her neighbors, the Howards, said she was polite but private, never had much company, never made much noise. She drove a blue 1977 Ford Fairmont, a compact sedan with a dented rear bumper and a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. It wasn't much to look at, but it ran fine, and that's all that mattered. On the evening of July 14, 1981, Deborah clocked in for her shift at Elk River Medical at 3:47 p.m. The time card was still in the hospital records years later, though the ink had faded to a pale gray. She worked the med-surg floor that night, checking vitals, distributing medication, comforting patients who couldn't sleep. Her co-workers remembered her being quieter than usual that week. Thomas Weller, an orderly who'd worked at the hospital for 5 years, told police later that Deborah seemed distracted. She wasn't herself, he said. Normally she'd chat during breaks, ask how your day was going. That week, she barely said 2 words. But Nancy Brewer, another nurse on the floor, disagreed. Deborah was fine, Nancy insisted during her interview. She talked about wanting to visit her aunt in Mobile. Said she might take a few days off in August. She seemed happy about it. The contradictions were small, easy to overlook at the time. Looking back, they became cracks no one could ignore. Deborah's shift ended at 11:30 p.m. She clocked out at 11:34 p.m., 4 minutes late, which wasn't unusual. The parking lot was nearly empty by then. Just her Fairmont, a rusted Chevy truck belonging to the janitor, and a station wagon that belonged to the night supervisor. The security light above the back entrance flickered on and off, casting uneven shadows across the gravel. Deborah walked to her car alone, her white shoes crunching softly against the stones. She unlocked the driver's side door, slid inside, and turned the key. The engine started on the first try. No one saw her leave the parking lot. No one heard anything unusual. The night was warm and still, and the only sound was the distant hum of the highway a mile south. Deborah should have been home by midnight. It was a 12-minute drive from the hospital to Chisholm Street, straight down McFarland Boulevard, left on Hermitage Drive, right onto her street. She'd made the drive 100 times before, maybe more, but she never made it home that night. Her mother, Evelyn, didn't realize anything was wrong until the next morning. Deborah usually called around 8 a.m. on her days off, just to check in. When the phone didn't ring by 9:30, Evelyn drove over to Chisholm Street. The yellow house looked exactly as it always did. The porch light was still on from the night before. The front door was locked. Evelyn knocked, then used her spare key to let herself in. Inside, everything was untouched. The bed was made. The dishes were washed and stacked neatly by the sink. Deborah's purse sat on the kitchen counter, her wallet still inside. Her work uniform from the previous shift hung on a hook by the bathroom door, but Deborah was gone, and so was her car. Evelyn called the hospital first, thinking maybe Deborah had been asked to cover an extra shift. The receptionist checked the schedule. No, Deborah wasn't on the floor. No one had called her in. Then Evelyn called the police. The Florence Police Department sent an officer to the house around 11 a.m. His name was Officer Raymond Pike, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who'd worked the department for nearly 20 years. He took notes, while Evelyn explained that her daughter always called, always checked in, and it wasn't like her to disappear without a word. Pike asked the standard questions. Had Deborah been upset recently? Was she seeing anyone? Had there been any arguments? Any trouble at work? Evelyn shook her head to all of it. She was fine, she said. She was happy. She loved her job. Pike told her to wait 48 hours. Most missing persons cases, he explained, resolved themselves within a day or two. People got sidetracked, forgot to call home, had a change of plans they didn't think to mention. But Evelyn knew better. She knew her daughter. By that evening, word had spread through Florence. The pharmacist mentioned it to a customer. The customer told her husband. The husband worked at the lumber mill with Deborah's uncle. By nightfall, half the town knew that Deborah Lynn Carter was missing. The next morning, when she still hadn't come home, the police opened an official investigation. They started by retracing her last known movements. Officers visited Elk River Medical and interviewed the staff who'd been working that night. Thomas Weller repeated what he'd said before, that Deborah had seemed distant, preoccupied. Nancy Brewer insisted she'd seemed perfectly normal. The night supervisor, a woman named Margaret Finch, said she'd seen Deborah leave through the back entrance around 11:35 p.m., maybe 11:40. She waved at me through the window, Margaret said. I waved back. That was the last time I saw her. The janitor, an older man named Curtis Lane, said he'd been emptying trash bins in the East Wing when Deborah left. He didn't see her, didn't hear anything unusual. The police checked Deborah's house again, this time more thoroughly. They found nothing out of place. No signs of a struggle. No indication she'd packed a bag or planned to leave town. Her clothes were still in the closet. Her toothbrush was still in the bathroom. Her car, the blue Fairmont, was still missing. On July 17th, 3 days after Deborah disappeared, a man named Leonard Pruitt called the police station. He lived out near the Shoal Creek Bridge, a narrow two-lane crossing about 8 miles west of Florence. He said he'd seen a blue car parked near the bridge on the night of the 14th, around midnight or a little after. I was driving home from my brother's place. Pruitt told the officer on the phone. Saw it sitting there on the shoulder, just past the bridge on the north side. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured someone broke down or pulled over to sleep. Officer Pike drove out to Shoal Creek Bridge that afternoon. The area was rural, surrounded by dense pine woods and farmland. The Tennessee River ran wide and slow beneath the bridge, its surface dark and unreadable in the afternoon light. Pike walked along the shoulder where Pruitt said he'd seen the car. There were tire tracks in the gravel, but nothing conclusive. No abandoned vehicle. No sign of Deborah. Still, the sighting was enough to shift the focus of the search. Volunteers from the community began combing the woods around the bridge, walking in slow lines through the underbrush, calling Deborah's name into the silence. They found nothing. Days became a week. The week became 2. Deborah's face appeared on flyers stapled to telephone poles and taped inside shop windows. The local radio station aired announcements every hour. The newspaper ran her photo on the front page. Beneath the headline, Florence Nurse, Still Missing. Evelyn Carter sat by the phone, waiting for it to ring. Deborah's friends organized search parties every weekend. The police followed up on every tip, every possible lead, no matter how small. But Deborah Lynn Carter had vanished, and no one could explain how or why. The last person to see her alive was Margaret Finch, the night supervisor, who'd waved goodbye through a hospital window. The last place her car had been seen was near Shoal Creek Bridge, a lonely stretch of road where the trees leaned close and the river kept its secrets. And somewhere between the hospital parking lot and that bridge, in the space of 12 minutes on a warm July night, Deborah had disappeared into the dark. The search for Deborah Lynn Carter consumed Florence in the summer of 1981. For the first 2 weeks, volunteers showed up every morning at the police station, ready to walk the woods, drag the riverbanks, knock on doors in neighborhoods where someone might have seen something. The Rotary Club organized search grids. The church ladies made sandwiches and lemonade for the volunteers. Local businesses donated supplies, flashlights, rope, first aid kits. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted to believe she'd be found. The police set up a command center in the community room at First Baptist Church. Maps of Lauderdale County covered the wall, marked with colored pins indicating where searches had been conducted, where tips had led them, where Deborah's car might have gone. Officer Raymond Pike became the unofficial face of the investigation. He gave updates to the local newspaper twice a week, always careful with his words, never promising more than he could deliver. "We're following every lead," he'd say. "We won't stop looking until we find her." But privately, Pike was running out of places to look. The woods around Shoal Creek Bridge had been searched 3 times. Divers from the county rescue team spent 2 days in the Tennessee River, scanning the murky bottom near the bridge. They found an old tire, a rusted shopping cart, a waterlogged suitcase that turned out to belong to a fisherman who'd lost it years earlier. They didn't find Deborah. They didn't find her car. The blue Ford Fairmont became the center of the investigation. If they could find the car, they reasoned, they'd find answers. The police issued a statewide alert. Every officer in Alabama had a description. 1977 Ford Fairmont, blue. License plate 3, J4729. Dented rear bumper. Rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. Tips came in from all over. Someone saw a blue car at a rest stop near Decatur. Someone else saw one parked behind a motel in Muscle Shoals. A trucker called to say he'd passed a blue Fairmont on Highway 72, heading east toward Huntsville. Pike and his team chased every lead. Every single one turned out to be a different car, a different person, a dead end. By early August, the search parties grew smaller. People had jobs to return to, families to take care of, lives that couldn't be put on hold indefinitely. The volunteers who'd shown up every day began showing up once a week, then once a month. Evelyn Carter never stopped. She walked the roads around Shoal Creek Bridge every afternoon, calling her daughter's name into the silence. She put up new flyers whenever the old ones faded or were torn down by the weather. She kept Deborah's room exactly as it had been, the bed made, the closet full of clothes, as if her daughter might walk through the door at any moment. "She's out there, somewhere," Evelyn told a reporter from the Florence Times-Daily in September. "I know she is, and I won't stop looking until I bring her home." The newspaper ran the story on page 3. By then, Deborah's disappearance had been pushed aside by other news: a factory closing, a school board election, a fire at the fairgrounds. The town was moving on, whether it meant to or not. The police investigation continued, but the urgency faded. Pike still worked the case when he could, but other calls came in. Other crimes demanded attention. The file on Deborah Lynn Carter grew thicker with reports and dead-end leads, and it sat on Pike's desk like a weight he couldn't lift. In October, a hunter found a woman's shoe near the Natchez Trace Parkway, about 30 miles south of Florence. It was white, worn at the toe, the kind nurses wore. Pike drove down to look at it himself, his stomach tight with dread. But it wasn't Deborah's shoe. The size was wrong. The brand was wrong. It had been there for months, maybe years, slowly decaying in the underbrush. Pike returned to Florence empty-handed, and the hope that had flickered briefly in the town died down again. By the time winter arrived, most people had accepted what no one wanted to say out loud. Deborah wasn't coming back. Whatever had happened to her on the night of July 14th, it was final, permanent. The case went cold. Not officially. The file stayed open. The investigation technically active, but in practice, it was over. Pike retired in 1984, and the case was passed to a younger detective named Gary Hollis. Hollis reviewed the file, made a few follow-up calls, but there was nothing new to pursue. The trail had gone cold years earlier. Deborah's mother, Evelyn, died in 1989. She was 63 years old. The obituary in the newspaper mentioned that she was survived by a son, 2 grandchildren, and a daughter, Deborah, whose whereabouts remained unknown. Even in death, Evelyn couldn't let go. The years rolled forward. The 1980s became the 1990s. Florence changed slowly, the way small towns do. The soda fountain downtown closed. The hospital expanded, adding a new wing and a parking garage. Chisholm Street was repaved. The Shoal Creek Bridge was widened to accommodate more traffic. But people still remembered Deborah Lynn Carter. Her story became part of the town's collective memory, passed down like folklore. Older residents would mention her name when the subject of unsolved mysteries came up. Younger people heard about her in high school, a cautionary tale about a woman who'd vanished without explanation. Some believed she'd run away, started a new life somewhere far from Florence. Others thought she'd been in an accident, her car submerged in a part of the river the divers had missed. A few whispered darker theories that she'd been taken, harmed, buried in the woods where no one would ever find her. The rumors grew and shifted over time, fed by speculation and the absence of facts. Without answers, people filled in the gaps with their own versions of the truth. Thomas Weller, the orderly Hood, said Deborah seemed distant, moved to Georgia in 1985. He never spoke publicly about the case again. Nancy Brewer, the nurse who'd insisted Deborah was planning a trip, stayed at Elk River Medical until she retired in 2003. She still lived in Florence, though she rarely talked about that summer. Margaret Finch, the night supervisor who'd waved goodbye, passed away in 1997. Her daughter found a journal among her belongings, but it contained nothing about Deborah, just daily observations about the weather and grocery lists. Leonard Pruitt, the man who'd seen the blue car near Shoal Creek Bridge, died in a farming accident in 1992. He'd told the story about the car dozens of times over the year, always insisting he'd seen it that night, always frustrated that no one had found it. And then there was Henry Colson. Colson lived in a small clapboard house about a quarter-mile from the Shoal Creek Bridge, set back from the road in a clearing surrounded by pine trees. He was in his 50s in 1981, a reclusive man who worked odd jobs and kept to himself. Neighbors described him as quiet, strange, someone who didn't care for company. In the weeks after Deborah disappeared, police interviewed nearly everyone who lived near the bridge, but somehow Colson slipped through the cracks. His name appeared in the case file only once, in a handwritten note by Officer Pike. Check with H. Colson, lives near bridge. No answer at residence. Pike never followed up. The investigation moved in other directions, and Colson was forgotten. In 1996, Henry Colson died of a heart attack. He was 68 years old. He died alone in his house, and his body wasn't discovered for 3 days. By the time police were informed, it was too late to ask him anything. Detective Gary Hollis heard about Colson's death and felt a pang of regret. He pulled the Carter file from storage and found Pike's note about the man who'd never been questioned. Hollis drove out to the property, but by then it had been sold to a couple from Tennessee who'd never heard of Deborah Lynn Carter. The moment was gone. Whatever Colson might have known, he'd taken it with him. The years continued to pass. The investigation stalled, then stagnated, then became a historical footnote. The case file was transferred to the Cold Case Unit in 2001, where it sat in a filing cabinet alongside dozens of other unsolved disappearances and homicides from decades past. Deborah's niece, a girl named Claire, grew up hearing stories about the aunt she'd never met. Claire was born in 1983, 2 years after Deborah vanished, and she became fascinated by the mystery. As a teenager, she'd spend hours at the public library, reading old newspaper articles on microfiche, trying to piece together what had happened. When Claire was 22, she decided to become a nurse, just like her aunt. She enrolled in the same nursing program at the University of North Alabama, walked the same hallways, studied the same subjects. It felt like a way of keeping Deborah's memory alive, of honoring a woman she'd never had the chance to know. By the mid-2000s, Florence had largely forgotten about Deborah Lynn Carter. Occasionally, someone would bring her up, a retired cop, a longtime resident, a journalist, working on a story about cold cases. But the trail was too old, the evidence too sparse, the witnesses too scattered or deceased. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. But in small towns, the past never really disappeared. It lingers in the soil, in the water, in the memories of those who remain. And sometimes, when enough time has passed, the silence begins to crack. Sometimes the things people tried to bury find their way back to the surface. It was the summer of 2007, 26 years after Deborah Lynn Carter vanished, when the first piece of the puzzle finally emerged, and it came from the last place anyone expected. The heat returned to Florence in the summer of 2007, just as it had in 1981. The cicadas hummed in the same relentless rhythm. The Tennessee River moved slow and dark beneath the Shoal Creek Bridge, and in a small clapboard house a quarter-mile from that bridge, a young couple from Tennessee was finally ready to begin renovations. Jason and Kelly Preston had bought the property in 2004, intending to fix it up as a weekend retreat. But life got in the way. Jobs, pregnancies, the endless demands of raising 2 young children. The house sat empty for 3 years, slowly deteriorating, its paint peeling, and its porch sagging under the weight of neglect. By the summer of 2007, they'd saved enough money to start the work. They hired a local contractor named Dennis Webb, a man in his 60s who'd been building and repairing houses in Lauderdale County for 40 years. Webb arrived on a Monday morning in late June with his tools and a thermos of coffee. The plan was to start with the interior, rip out the old carpet, replace the rotted floorboard, update the electrical wiring. The house had been built in the 1950s, and it looked every year of its age. The previous owner had been Henry Colson, though the Prestons didn't know much about him. The real estate agent had mentioned he'd lived alone, died in the house, and that the property had sat vacant for years before being sold. That was all they knew. Webb started in the living room, pulling up the stained brown carpet that had been there for decades. Beneath it, the floorboards were warped and discolored, some of them soft with rot. He pried them up carefully, one by one, exposing the crawl space beneath. That's when he saw it. Tucked into the gap between two floor joists, hidden in shadow and dust, was a small wooden box. Webb stopped working. He crouched down, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The box was maybe 8 inches long, 4 inches wide, made of dark wood with tarnished brass hinges. It had been placed deliberately, wedged tightly so it wouldn't shift or fall. He reached down and pulled it free. The wood was cold to the touch, coated in a fine layer of grime. Webb carried it outside into the sunlight, setting it on the porch railing. Jason and Kelly Preston, who'd been unloading supplies from their truck, walked over to see what he'd found. "What is it?" Kelly asked. "Don't know yet," Webb said. "Found it under the floor." He tried to open the box, but the hinges were stiff with age. He had to work a screwdriver into the seam to pry it loose. When the lid finally came free, the three of them stood in silence, staring at what was inside. A nurse's name badge, white plastic, rectangular, with a small safety pin on the back. The name printed on it, slightly faded but still legible, read Deborah Carter. RN. Beneath the badge was a small notebook with a marbled black and white cover, the kind students used in school. The pages were yellowed, some of them stuck together with moisture and time. And beneath the notebook was a silver locket on a delicate chain, the surface tarnished and scratched. Kelly Preston's hand went to her mouth. "Oh my God." Jason picked up the badge, turning it over in his hands. "Who's Deborah Carter?" Webb's face had gone pale. He was old enough to remember, old enough to have been there when it happened. "She was a nurse," Webb said quietly. "Disappeared back in 81. Nobody ever found her." Kelly's eyes widened. "This was her house?" "No," Webb said. "This was Henry Colson's house. He lived here when she went missing." The three of them stood on the porch in the Alabama heat, the cicadas humming around them, and a silence settled over the property that felt heavier than the summer air. Jason Preston pulled out his cell phone and called the police. Detective Sergeant Marcus Freeman arrived at the property 40 minutes later. Freeman was 38 years old, a 14-year veteran of the Florence Police Department who'd been assigned to the cold case unit 2 years earlier. He'd heard about Deborah Lynn Carter. Of course, every cop in Florence knew the story, but he'd never worked the case himself. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves and carefully examined the contents of the box. The name badge, the notebook, the locket. Each item was placed into a separate evidence bag, tagged and photographed. Freeman asked Dennis Webb to show him exactly where he'd found the box. They went back inside, and Webb pointed to the gap between the floor joists in the living room. Freeman crouched down with a flashlight, studying the space. "How long do you think it's been there?" Freeman asked. Webb shrugged. "Hard to say. Could have been years. Could have been decades. That carpet was original to the house, far as I can tell." Freeman stood up, brushing dust from his pants. "You said the previous owner was Henry Colson." "That's right. Lived here alone for years. Died in 96, I think." Freeman made a note of that. Back at the station, he pulled the original case file on Deborah Lynn Carter and spread the contents across his desk. Incident reports, witness statements, search logs, photographs of Deborah, of her house, of the Shoal Creek Bridge. And there, buried in the middle of the file, was Officer Raymond Pike's handwritten note from 1981. "Check with H. Colson. Lives near bridge. No answer at residence." Freeman leaned back in his chair, staring at the note. Henry Colson had never been properly interviewed, and now, more than a quarter-century later, Deborah Carter's name badge had been found hidden beneath the floorboards of his house. The next day, Freeman returned to the property with a forensics team. They spent hours searching the house, the crawl space, the yard. They were looking for anything else that might have been hidden. Clothing, personal effects, any sign of what had happened to Deborah. They didn't find much. The house had been gutted and cleaned multiple times over the years, but in the attic, wedged behind a water-stained cardboard box, they found a single photograph. It was a Polaroid, faded and discolored with age. The image showed a stretch of road at night, illuminated by headlights. In the center of the frame was a blue car, parked on the shoulder. The license plate was visible, though barely. 3J4729. Deborah's car. Freeman held the photograph carefully, his pulse quickening. Someone had taken this picture. Someone had stood on that road in the dark and documented the scene. On the back of the Polaroid, written in blue ink that had faded to grey, was a single line: "She won't leave." Freeman brought the notebook back to the station and spent the evening going through it, page by page. The handwriting was small and neat, unmistakably feminine. Most of the entries were mundane: shift schedules, medication notes, reminders to pick up groceries or call her mother. But toward the end of the notebook, the tone shifted. June 28, 1981. He was at the hospital again today, watching I Don't Know What He Wants. July 2nd, 1981. He followed me home last week. I'm sure of it. I saw the same truck twice. July 9th, 1981. I told Nancy, but she thinks I'm being paranoid. Maybe I am, but I can't shake the feeling. July 12th, 1981. He waits by the water. That was the last entry, 2 days before Deborah disappeared. Freeman read the words again and again, trying to piece together what they meant. Who was he? Why was Deborah afraid? And why hadn't she told anyone? Her mother, the police, someone who could help. He cross-referenced the notebook with the original witness statements. Nancy Brewer, the nurse who'd worked with Deborah, had told police that Deborah seemed perfectly fine in the days before she vanished. But according to the notebook, Deborah had told Nancy she was being followed, and Nancy had dismissed it. Freeman called Nancy Brewer. She was 71 years old, now retired, living in a modest house on the east side of Florence. She agreed to meet with him the next day. They sat in her living room, the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. Freeman showed her the notebook, opened to the entry where Deborah mentioned her name. Nancy's face went pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the page. "I don't remember this," she said quietly. "You told police," she seemed happy, Freeman said, "that she was planning a trip." Nancy nodded slowly. "That's what I believe. That's what I told them." "But she came to you," Freeman pressed. "She said someone was following her." Nancy set the notebook down, her eyes distant. "I didn't think it was serious. Deborah was. She was sensitive. She worried about things. I thought she was just stressed from work." "Did she say who it was? Who was following her?" Nancy shook her head. "No, she didn't give me a name. She just said she felt like someone was watching her. I told her she was working too hard, that she needed a vacation." Freeman waited. "I should have listened," Nancy said, her voice breaking. "I should have taken her seriously." The locket was sent to the State Forensics Lab in Montgomery. Freeman wanted it examined for fingerprints, DNA, anything that might identify who'd handled it, or why it had been hidden. The results came back 3 weeks later. The locket had been wiped clean. No prints, no DNA, nothing usable. But when the lab technician opened the locket, they found a small photograph inside. It was a picture of Deborah, smiling, standing in front of a Christmas tree. On the back, in the same handwriting from the Polaroid, were 3 words: "Mine to keep." Freeman stared at the photograph, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Whoever had written those words, whoever had hidden that box beneath the floorboards of Henry Colson's house, had taken the locket from Deborah, and they'd kept it as a trophy. Freeman began digging into Henry Colson's background. Colson had been 54 years old when Deborah disappeared. He'd lived alone, worked as a handyman, had no criminal record. Neighbors described him as quiet, odd, someone who kept to himself. But there was something else. In 1978, 3 years before Deborah vanished, a woman named Patricia Holbrook had filed a complaint against Colson. She claimed he'd been following her, showing up at her workplace, leaving notes on her car. The case had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, and Patricia had moved out of state shortly afterward. Freeman tracked Patricia down in Tennessee. She was in her 60s now, remarried, living in a quiet suburb outside Nashville. When Freeman called and explained why he was reaching out, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I knew it," Patricia finally said. "I knew something was wrong with him." She agreed to meet with Freeman the following week. They sat in a coffee shop in Nashville, and Patricia told her story. "He was obsessed with me," she said. "He'd show up everywhere I went, the grocery store, the bank, my job. He never said anything threatening, never touched me, but he was always there, always watching. Did you ever see him near the hospital? Freeman asked. Patricia frowned. I didn't work at the hospital. I worked at a diner downtown. But yes, I saw him near Elk River Medical a few times. I thought maybe he had a doctor's appointment or something. Freeman showed her a photograph of Deborah. Did you ever see him with this woman? Patricia studied the photo, then shook her head. No, but that doesn't mean he wasn't watching her too. Back in Florence, Freeman organized a second search of the property where the box had been found. This time, they brought cadaver dogs. The dogs alerted near the tree line at the back of the property, about 50 yards from the house. The forensics team marked the area and began to dig. They didn't find human remains, but they found something else. Buried 3 feet down, wrapped in a plastic tarp, was a blue duffel bag. Inside the bag was a pair of white nursing shoes, a set of car keys, and a blood-stained hospital scrub top. The blood was too degraded for DNA analysis, but the keys matched the description of the ones Deborah had carried, and the scrub top had a name embroidered on the chest pocket. D. Carter Freeman stood at the edge of the excavation site, staring down at the evidence bags laid out on the ground. The pieces were coming together, slowly, like fragments of a shattered mirror. Deborah had been here, on this property, in the hours or days after she disappeared. And Henry Colson, the man who'd lived here, the man who'd died before police could question him, had taken her things and hidden them beneath his house and in his yard. Freeman didn't have all the answers yet. He didn't know exactly what had happened on the night of July 14th, 1981, or how Deborah had ended up at this property. But he knew enough. He knew that Deborah Lynn Carter hadn't simply vanished. She'd been taken, and the man responsible had been living a quarter-mile from Shoal Creek Bridge, watching the search parties, watching the town mourn, knowing that no one would ever find the truth, until now. The story broke in the Florence Times Daily on August 12, 2007. The headline read, "Evidence in 1981, Cold Case Points to Deceased Suspect." By noon, the story had spread across Alabama. By evening, it had reached national news outlets. Cable news programs ran segments on the nurse who'd vanished 26 years ago and the reclusive man who'd hidden the truth beneath his floorboard. Deborah Lynn Carter's name was back in the public consciousness, but this time there was more than just mystery. There were answers. Partial, incomplete, but answers nonetheless. Detective Marcus Freeman became the point person for media inquiries, though he was careful about what he revealed. The investigation was still active. Evidence was still being analyzed, and there were still gaps in the timeline that needed to be filled, but the public wanted closure. The town wanted to know what had happened to Deborah. Freeman wanted the same thing. He spent the next several weeks tracking down anyone who'd known Henry Colson, anyone who might have seen something in the summer of 1981, anyone whose memory might hold a missing piece of the puzzle. Most of the people who'd lived near Colson's property were dead or had moved away, but Freeman found a few who remained. One of them was a woman named Lorraine Dawes, who'd lived a half-mile down the road from Colson in the early 1980s. She was 82 years old now, living in a nursing home in Muscle Shoals. Her memory was fragile, but when Freeman mentioned Henry Colson's name, something flickered in her eyes. "I remember him," she said, kept to himself. "Never friendly. Did you ever see him with anyone?" Freeman asked. "A woman, maybe. Someone who didn't belong there." Lorraine's face tightened, as if she were reaching for something just beyond her grasp. "There was a car," she said slowly. "Blue car. I saw it at his place one night." Freeman leaned forward. "When summer," Lorraine said. 81 maybe. "I was driving home late from my sister's house. Saw the car parked in his driveway. Thought it was strange, because Henry never had visitors." "Did you see anyone inside the car, or near it?" Lorraine shook her head. "Just the car. I didn't think much of it at the time, but a few days later, I heard about that nurse who went missing, and I wondered." Her voice trailed off. "Did you tell anyone?" Freeman asked gently. "I called the police station," Lorraine said. "Left a message, but no one ever called me back." Freeman checked the records when he returned to the station. There it was, a phone message logged on July 19, 1981, from a Lorraine Dawes, reporting a blue car at Henry Colson's residence. The message had been filed, noted, and apparently forgotten in the flood of other tips that had come in during those frantic weeks. Another missed opportunity. Another thread that should have been followed. Freeman wondered how different things might have been if someone had returned that call. If someone had knocked on Henry Colson's door in July of 1981, asked him a few questions, looked around the property, But they hadn't, and Coulson had lived another 15 years, undisturbed, the evidence buried and hidden. The forensics team continued to search the property. They used ground-penetrating radar to scan the yard, looking for any other anomalies beneath the surface. They found old trash, discarded furniture, a rusted toolbox, but they didn't find Deborah. Freeman had to accept the possibility that her remains might never be recovered. Coulson's property bordered dense woods and farmland. The Tennessee River was less than a mile away. There were 1,000 places where someone could disappear forever. Still, Freeman kept searching. He brought in a forensic psychologist named Dr. Ellen Richter to help build a profile of Henry Coulson. Dr. Richter reviewed the evidence, the hidden box, the notebook, the Polaroid, the pattern of stalking behavior. "This is a possessive offender," Dr. Richter explained. "Someone who fixates on a target, follows them, inserts himself into their life without their consent. The trophies, the badge, the locket, the photograph indicate he wanted to keep parts of her, to own her, in a sense." "Do you think he planned it?" Freeman asked. "Or was it opportunistic?" "Likely a combination," Dr. Richter said. He'd been watching her, stalking her. He knew her routine, knew when she'd be vulnerable. But the actual act, the abduction, was probably impulsive. Something triggered him that night. Maybe she rejected him, ignored him, or tried to get away. Freeman thought about the notebook entry. "He waits by the water." Deborah had known, she'd sensed the danger. She'd written about it 2 days before she vanished. And no one had listened. In mid-September, Freeman received a call from a man named Curtis Fry, a retired mechanic who'd worked at a gas station near Shoal Creek Bridge in the early 1980s. "I saw the news about Henry Coulson," Fry said, "and I remembered something." Freeman drove out to meet him. They sat on Fry's front porch, drinking sweet tea in the afternoon heat. "Henry used to come by the station sometimes," Fry said, "usually late at night. He'd buy gas, maybe a soda from the machine. Didn't talk much. Do you remember seeing him the night of July 14th, 1981? Freeman asked. Fry nodded slowly. "I think so. It was a Tuesday night, real quiet. Henry came in around midnight, maybe a little after. Bought $10 of gas, paid in cash. Did he say anything? Seemed nervous?" "Not really," Fry said. "But I remember his hands. They were shaking when he handed me the money. And there was dirt under his fingernails, like he'd been digging." Freeman made a note of that. "Did you see his truck? What he was driving?" "Old Chevy pickup," Fry said. "Dark green. Had some tools in the bed. Maybe a tarp. Did you tell the police this back in 81? Fry shook his head. "Didn't think of it at the time. It was just Henry being Henry. Wasn't until I heard about the nurse going missing that I wondered if there was a connection. But by then, I figured the police had already looked into him." Freeman thanked Fry for coming forward, even if it was 26 years late. Every piece mattered. Every detail helped fill in the picture. In October, Freeman received the final forensic report on the blood-stained scrub top found buried on Coulson's property. The blood had been too degraded for a full DNA profile, but the lab had been able to extract a partial profile, enough to confirm it was consistent with Deborah's blood type. It wasn't definitive proof, but combined with everything else, the notebook, the locket, the Polaroid, the witness statements, it was enough. Freeman called a press conference on October 18, 2007. He stood at a podium in the Florence Police Department, flanked by the police chief and the district attorney, and addressed the cameras. After 26 years, Freeman said, "We can now say with a high degree of certainty that Deborah Lynn Carter was abducted and killed by Henry Coulson on the night of July 14, 1981. While we may never recover her remains, the evidence is clear. Deborah did not leave voluntarily. She was taken from us, and the person responsible can no longer harm anyone." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "This case is officially closed." The news brought a complicated kind of closure to Florence. For some, it was a relief. After decades of uncertainty, there was finally an answer. Deborah hadn't run away. She hadn't started a new life somewhere. She'd been taken by a predator who'd hidden in plain sight. For others, the revelation brought anger and frustration. How had Coulson been overlooked in the original investigation? How had so many tips and warning signs been missed? How many other cases might have been solved if the system had worked the way it should have? There were no easy answers to those questions. Freeman knew that he'd read the original case file a dozen times. He'd seen the gaps, the missed opportunities, the ways the investigation had faltered under the weight of too many leads and not enough resources. It was easy to look back now and see where things had gone wrong. It was harder to accept that sometimes, even when everyone was trying their best, the system failed. Claire Carter, Deborah's niece, drove down to Florence in November. She was 24 years old, a newly licensed registered nurse, working at a hospital in Tuscaloosa. She'd never met her aunt, but she'd carried Deborah's memory her entire life. A ghost she'd never known. A story without an ending. Until now, Freeman met with Claire at the police station. He showed her the evidence, the notebook, the locket, the photographs. He explained what they'd found, what they believed had happened, and why they couldn't bring Deborah home. Claire listened quietly, tears streaming down her face. When Freeman finished, she asked if she could keep the locket. "It's evidence," Freeman said gently. "But when the case is officially archived, I'll make sure you get it." Claire nodded. She reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph of her own, a picture of herself in her nursing uniform, standing outside the hospital where she worked. "I wanted to be like her," Claire said. "Even though I never knew her, I wanted to honor her memory." To finish what she started, Freeman took the photograph and looked at it for a long moment. The resemblance was striking. The same soft features, the same kind eyes. "She'd be proud of you," Freeman said. On a cold afternoon in December, Claire organized a memorial service for Deborah at the Shoal Creek Bridge. About 50 people attended, former co-workers from the hospital, neighbors who remembered Deborah, a few journalists, and Detective Marcus Freeman. They stood on the side of the road, near the spot where Deborah's car had been seen all those years ago, and they listened as Claire spoke about the aunt she'd never met. "Deborah gave her life to helping others," Claire said. "She cared for people when they were sick, comforted them when they were scared, and never asked for anything in return. Her story ended in tragedy, but her legacy lives on in every nurse who chooses this profession, who chooses to care." Claire placed a bouquet of white roses on the bridge railing. Others followed, adding flowers until the railing was covered in white and green. As the sun set over the Tennessee River, casting long shadows across the water, the small crowd stood in silence. Some prayed, some cried, some simply stood and remembered. Deborah Lynn Carter had been gone for 26 years, but in that moment, on that bridge, she was present. She was remembered. She was mourned. And for the first time since 1981, the people of Florence could say her name without the weight of unanswered questions. In the weeks that followed, life in Florence returned to its normal rhythm. The news cameras left. The reporters moved on to other stories. The cold case file on Deborah Lynn Carter was archived, marked as solved, and placed in storage. But the story didn't end there. Claire continued to visit the Shoal Creek Bridge every year, leaving white roses on the anniversary of her aunt's disappearance. She became a vocal advocate for victims' families, working with cold case units across Alabama to ensure that unsolved cases weren't forgotten. Detective Marcus Freeman stayed with the Florence Police Department until his retirement in 2019. He never stopped thinking about the cases he'd worked, the lives that had been lost, the families that had waited years for answers. And every summer, when the heat returned and the cicadas began their endless hum, Freeman would drive out to the Shoal Creek Bridge. He'd stand on the side of the road, looking out at the dark water, and he'd think about the night Deborah Lynn Carter disappeared. He'd think about the minutes between the hospital parking lot and the bridge, the moment when her car was forced to stop, the fear she must have felt, the fight she must have put up. He'd think about Henry Colson, the man who'd stolen her life and hidden the truth for 15 years. And he'd think about the fragile, imperfect nature of justice, how sometimes it arrives too late, how sometimes it never arrives at all. But in this case, at least, the truth had emerged. It had taken 26 years, but it had emerged. And that, Freeman believed, was worth something. The last word belongs to Nancy Brewer, the nurse who dismissed Deborah's fears in the days before she vanished. In 2010, 3 years after the case was closed, Nancy gave an interview to a documentary filmmaker who was producing a program about cold cases in the South. She was 74 years old by then, her hair white, her hands frail. The filmmaker asked her if she had any regrets. Nancy was quiet for a long time. Then she looked directly into the camera and spoke. "I think about Deborah every day," she said. "I think about the moment she came to me, scared, telling me someone was following her. And I think about how I dismissed her, how I told her she was worrying too much." Her voice broke. "I should have listened. I should have taken her seriously. If I had, maybe she'd still be here. Maybe everything would have been different." She paused, wiping her eyes. "I can't change what happened. I can't bring her back. But I can tell anyone who's listening, when someone tells you they're scared, when someone says they don't feel safe, believe them, listen to them. Don't wait until it's too late. The filmmaker asked if she'd ever forgiven herself. Nancy shook her head. No, she said, and I don't think I ever will. The Shoal Creek Bridge still stands today, wider now, repaved, busy with traffic during the morning and evening commute. But if you drive past it on a summer night, when the air is thick and the cicadas are humming, you might notice a small memorial on the north side of the bridge, a simple wooden cross, painted white, with a single name carved into the wood, Deborah. And if you stop your car and step out into the warm Alabama darkness, you might hear the river moving slow and steady beneath the bridge, carrying secrets it will never tell, carrying memories it will never forget. Deborah Lynn Carter was 26 years old when she disappeared. She wanted to help people. She wanted to make a difference. She wanted to live a long, full life. Henry Colson took that from her. He took her future, her dreams, her voice. But he couldn't take her memory. And in the end, the silence spoke louder than any confession. There are stories that end, and there are stories that linger. The case of Deborah Lynn Carter belongs to the second kind. Even after the press conferences, after the evidence was catalogued and archived, after the memorial service at Shoal Creek Bridge, the story continued to ripple through Florence, Alabama, like a stone thrown into still water. People talked about it in diners and church basements. They debated it in letters to the editor. They taught it to their children as a cautionary tale about trust, about vigilance, about the thin line between safety and danger. And they asked the questions that would never have clear answers. In the spring of 2008, a local history teacher named Martin Erskine began a project with his high school students. He wanted them to research unsolved crimes in Lauderdale County, to understand how investigations worked, how evidence was gathered, how cases went cold. Deborah's case became the centerpiece of the project. The students interviewed Detective Marcus Freeman, reviewed newspaper archives, and mapped out the timeline of events from July 1981 to the discovery in 2007. They created a presentation that was eventually displayed at the Florence Lauderdale Public Library, where it remained for 6 months. One of the students, a girl named Hannah Price, became particularly invested in the case. She was 16 years old, the same age Deborah had been when she decided to become a nurse. Hannah spent hours poring over the details, trying to understand how someone could vanish so completely, how the truth could stay hidden for so long. She wrote an essay about it for her English class. The essay was titled "The Weight of Silence." In it, she wrote, Deborah Carter died alone, afraid, and unheard. But her story didn't die with her. It lived in the silence of a town that knew something was wrong, but couldn't name it. It lived in the floorboards of a house where secrets were buried. And it lived in the hearts of people who never forgot her, even when they didn't know what had happened. The essay won a regional writing competition. Hannah went on to study criminal justice at Auburn University. She later became a victim advocate, working with families of missing persons across the state. When asked why she chose that path, she always mentioned Deborah. Her story changed the way I see the world, Hannah said in an interview years later. It taught me that silence isn't neutral. Silence protects the guilty and erases the victim. And if we want justice, we have to be willing to speak. The property where Henry Colson lived was eventually sold again in 2010. The new owners, a retired couple from Georgia, knew about the history. They'd read the news stories, seen the documentaries, understood what had been found beneath the floorboards and buried in the yard. They bought it anyway. We wanted to bring light back to this place, the wife, Margaret Sutton, told a local reporter. We wanted it to be a home again, not a crime scene. They renovated the house completely. New floors, new walls, a fresh coat of paint. They planted a garden in the backyard where the forensics team had dug. They hung wind chimes on the porch. And on the anniversary of Deborah's disappearance, they placed a small stone marker near the edge of the property, inscribed with a single line, in memory of those who were lost. Not everyone understood their decision. Some people in Florence thought the house should have been torn down, the land left empty as a kind of tribute. But the Suttons believed that letting the place decay would be another kind of victory for Henry Colson. He took enough, Margaret said. He doesn't get to take this too. In 2012, a filmmaker named Rachel Winters produced a documentary about Deborah's case. It was called The Nurse Who Disappeared, and it aired on a regional cable network before being picked up by a streaming platform. The documentary featured interviews with Detective Freeman, Nancy Brewer, Claire Carter, and several of Deborah's former co-workers. It included archival footage of the 1981 search efforts, photographs of the evidence found in 2007, and atmospheric shots of the Shoal Creek Bridge at dusk. The final scene of the documentary showed Claire standing on the bridge, holding a bouquet of white roses. "People ask me if I have closure," Claire said, looking out at the river. "And I don't know how to answer that, because closure suggests something is finished, something is over. But Deborah's absence isn't over. It's part of my family's story now. It's part of who I am." She paused, the wind lifting her hair. "But I do have peace. Peace, knowing that her story was told, that someone cared enough to keep looking, even after 26 years, that she wasn't forgotten." The documentary was nominated for an Emmy in the category of Outstanding Historical Documentary. It didn't win, but it brought Deborah's story to a national audience, sparking renewed interest in cold cases across the country. Detective Marcus Freeman retired from the Florence Police Department in December 2019. After 33 years of service, his colleagues threw him a small party at the station, with cake and coffee and a plaque commemorating his work on dozens of cases. But the case he talked about most, the one he considered his most important, was Deborah Lynn Carter. "It wasn't the biggest case I ever worked," Freeman said during his retirement speech. "It wasn't the most complicated, but it was the one that reminded me why I became a cop in the first place." He looked around the room at the younger officers, some of whom hadn't even been born when Deborah disappeared. "We do this job because people need us," Freeman said. "Because victims need someone to fight for them, even when they can't fight for themselves. And families need someone to keep looking, even when hope seems impossible." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Deborah needed that, and I'm grateful I was able to give it to her, even if it came too late." After he retired, Freeman volunteered with a non-profit organization that provided support to families of missing persons. He helped them navigate the legal system, connected them with investigative resources, and offered the kind of patience and empathy that only someone who'd lived through it could provide. He never forgot Deborah, or he never stopped thinking about the case. And every summer, on July 14th, he drove out to the Shoal Creek Bridge and left a single white rose on the memorial. In 2015, the Alabama Bureau of Investigation launched a cold case database, making it easier for families and investigators to share information about unsolved disappearances and homicides. Deborah Lynn Carter's case was one of the first to be entered into the system. Her profile included photographs, a timeline of events, a summary of the evidence, and contact information for anyone who might have additional information. The database was designed to ensure that cases like hers wouldn't be forgotten, wouldn't slip through the cracks the way they had in the past. By 2020, the database had helped solve 17 cold cases across Alabama, including 2 disappearances from the 1970s and a homicide from 1989. Claire Carter became a spokesperson for the program, traveling to police departments and community centers to talk about the importance of preserving evidence, following up on tips, and never giving up on the missing. "My aunt's case was solved because someone refused to stop looking," Claire said at a conference in Montgomery, "because evidence was preserved. Because people came forward, even decades later. And that's what we need to keep doing, for every victim, for every family, for every person who's waiting for answers." Her voice carried the weight of lived experience, of someone who'd spent her entire life in the shadow of an unanswered question. "We owe it to them," she said. "We owe it to Deborah." The Shoal Creek Bridge became a place of pilgrimage for people interested in true crime, in cold cases, in stories that defied easy resolution. They came from all over the country, sometimes in small groups, sometimes alone. They'd stand on the side of the road, taking photographs, reading the memorial plaque, leaving flowers or handwritten notes. Some locals found it unsettling. Others saw it as a kind of tribute, a way of ensuring Deborah's memory stayed alive. The Florence Police Department installed a small plaque near the memorial in 2018 with a brief summary of Deborah's story and a reminder to respect the site. The plaque ended with a line that had become something of a motto for those who worked cold cases. "The truth always surfaces. Sometimes it just takes time." In the fall of 2021, 40 years after Deborah disappeared, the Florence Times-Daily published a special edition commemorating the anniversary. The front page featured a large photograph of Deborah in her nursing uniform, smiling at the camera. The headline read, "40 years later, a town remembers." Inside, there were articles about the original investigation, the 2007 discovery, the impact the case had on the community. There were essays from people who'd known Deborah, from investigators who'd worked the case, from family members who'd never stopped grieving. Nancy Brewer, now 85 years old, contributed a letter. It was short, handwritten, and printed in full, on page 4. "I think about Deborah every single day," she wrote. "I think about the moment I failed her, the moment I didn't listen. I carry that with me, and I will carry it until I die. If there's one thing I could tell the world, it's this. When someone is afraid, believe them. When someone asks for help, give it. Don't wait. Don't assume it will be okay, because sometimes it won't be." The letter ended with a single sentence. "I'm sorry, Deborah. I'm so sorry." Claire Carter never stopped visiting the Shoal Creek Bridge. Every July 14th, without fail, she drove down from Tuscaloosa to Florence. She brought white roses, the same flowers she'd carried to the first memorial service in 2007. She stood on the bridge for a few minutes, speaking quietly to the aunt she'd never met, updating her on the years that had passed, the lives that had been lived, the changes that had come. In 2023, Claire brought her daughter, a 3-year-old girl with chestnut brown hair and kind eyes. "This is your great-aunt, Deborah," Claire said, kneeling beside the memorial. "She was a nurse. She helped people, and she's the reason we're here." The little girl didn't fully understand, but she placed a rose on the memorial anyway, her small hand careful and deliberate. Claire watched her daughter, and for the first time in years, she felt something shift inside her. Not closure, exactly, but something close to it. Acceptance, maybe, or peace. The knowledge that Deborah's story, tragic as it was, had meaning, that it had changed lives, inspired action, kept people vigilant, that her aunt's life, though cut short, had mattered. The Tennessee River still flows beneath the Shoal Creek Bridge, dark and steady and silent. It's been more than 40 years since Deborah Lynn Carter disappeared. More than 40 years since Henry Colson took her life and buried the truth. But the river remembers, the town remembers, and the people who loved her, who searched for her, who refused to let her story be forgotten. They remember too. On quiet summer nights, when the cicadas hum and the heat clings to everything, you can still feel it. The weight of what happened, the echo of a life interrupted, the presence of something unresolved, even in resolution. Florence, Alabama, is a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where history is written in the soil and carried in the memories of those who remain. And in that history, Deborah Lynn Carter holds a particular place. Not just as a victim, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of the fragility of safety, the importance of listening, and the endurance of memory. Her story doesn't have a happy ending, but it has an ending. And for those who waited 26 years for answers, that's something. Detective Marcus Freeman passed away in his sleep on a warm June night in 2024. He was 75 years old. His obituary in the Florence Times-Daily mentioned his decades of service, his dedication to justice, and the dozens of cases he'd solved over his career. But the part that drew the most attention, the part that people remembered, was the final paragraph. Marcus will be remembered for his unwavering commitment to the victims he served. He believed that every person deserved justice, no matter how much time had passed, no matter how cold the trail had grown. He gave Deborah Lynn Carter her voice when no one else could. And for that, we are grateful. At his funeral, Claire Carter spoke. She thanked Freeman for the work he'd done, the care he'd shown, the peace he'd given her family. He could have given up, Claire said. He could have let the case stay buried, but he didn't. He kept digging. He kept asking questions. He kept believing that the truth mattered. She looked out at the assembled mourners, and because of him, my aunt's story doesn't end in silence. It ends in truth. And that makes all the difference. The last roses placed at the Shoal Creek Bridge Memorial were left on July 14, 2024, the 43rd anniversary of Deborah's disappearance. No one saw who left them, but the flowers were fresh, carefully arranged, tied with a white ribbon. On the ribbon, in small handwritten letters, was a single phrase, "Still remembered, still loved." The sun set that evening over the Tennessee River, casting long golden light across the water. The bridge was quiet, the traffic sparse. The cicadas began their nightly chorus, filling the air with sound. And somewhere in that sound, in the rustle of leaves, and the movement of the river, and the fading light of day, there was a kind of peace. Not resolution, perhaps. Not justice in the way we wish it could be. But acknowledgement, memory. The refusal to forget. How long does a town remember? As long as someone is left to tell the story. As long as there are white roses on a bridge railing. As long as people like Claire, like Freeman, like the students who study the case, and the families who lived through it, keep speaking. Deborah Lynn Carter is gone. She's been gone for more than 40 years. But her name endures. Her story endures. And in a world where so many disappear without a trace, without a voice, without anyone to fight for them, that endurance means something. It means that silence, no matter how deep, no matter how long, is never truly final. It means that the truth, buried and hidden though it may be, always finds a way to surface. And it means that Deborah, wherever she is not forgotten. She never was. She never will be. Sometimes, truth survives only in the memories of those who still wait. And sometimes, when you drive past the Shoal Creek Bridge on a summer night, when the air is warm and the river is dark and the cicadas are humming their ancient song, you might feel it. The weight of a story that refuses to end. The echo of a voice that was silenced, but never truly lost. The presence of Deborah Lynn Carter, young nurse, gentle soul, forever 26, still here, in the only way that matters now. In memory, in truth, in the hearts of those who remember.